Fran, we were talking about intercultural learning, and I know that you've got some thoughts to share and some slides that you'd like me to see, so go ahead.
So I'd like to start by introducing the idea that there is more than one tradition of thought that underpins the way in which one understands relationships in intercultural learning. And these are phrased here as Western and Eastern traditions of thought, with a Western tradition coming from Socrates and Eastern tradition coming from Confucius.
So the Western tradition, Socratic, is going to be more binary.
It is, yes. And it tends to focus on culture or things as an object.
Right.
So, for example, if we're thinking about culture, you might look on culture and the object or the dimensions of culture, such as language, dress, eating habits, whatever it might be. Whereas from an Eastern tradition, if it's a relational way or a relational understanding, culture is understood only in the way in which differences relate to each other. So we might relate to each other, and if gender is taken to be a dimension of culture, I might come to a better understanding of what femaleness is by relating to maleness and vice versa. So that's a relational way of understanding culture, that instead of it being an object that's separate from us, it's something that we come to understand through the interaction between us.
So one of the interesting things here is it's going to have huge implications for identity and how you view yourself as well as how you're viewing others.
Others' differences and cultural differences. Yeah. So if we move through to the next slide, one of the arguments is that when culture is viewed as an object, what that tends to do is to isolate it in little boxes, and particularly if we're thinking of ethnicity and race, that Britishness would be put in the box of British and Chinese would be put in the box of Chinese, and so on.
We all know that's a nonsense. I mean, that is the whole debate, isn't it, about what is Britishness?
Yes, exactly. And by putting it in a box as well, it doesn't recognise the diversity within the box. It tends to view everybody who calls themselves British as holding those characteristics, and it also sort of fossilises.
Yeah, it sounds very static,
culture.
Doesn't it?
Yes.
It's a static way of looking at it.
Yeah. So moving forward, we've explored what an object-based tradition of thought and what a relational tradition of thought might say about cultural similarity and difference. There are three models here that I've developed.
Right.
The first two are based on an object-focused tradition of thought, and the third on a relational tradition of thought.
Right.
Okay.
And so you've got a large blue circle there in the centre. What does that represent?
So the blue circle that holds triangles represents a dominant group in society, and I'm thinking obviously about UK society here, which would be white Western.
Right.
And the other shapes around represent what we might call minority ethnic groups or communities.
And that doesn't look very inclusive.
No, because they're all existing outside of the dominant culture. So in the 1980s, when I first started teaching, a response to that, which was an inclusive response, was to say, let's find a category that is similar to all of us. And a category that was similar to all of us was, we're all human.
Yeah.
So by focusing on we're all human, immediately the circle expands to include minority ethnic communities as well. But the problem for that is that by doing so, the differences tend to get smoothed over. And that it is the dominant group's characteristics that still dominate. And they are the ones who are deciding like or not like us, same or not the same as us, when making decisions about who to include within that inclusive category, we are all human. And clearly that's a problem.
Yes, and that was actually what we had to grapple with in the national curriculum. I remember we had to teach, or the advice was to stress similarities, which is that model.
Absolutely.
But it downs out the differences.
It does. And as we've seen from the Western and Eastern traditions of thought, if through relating you focus on each other's differences, actually it's possible to come to understand oneself much more deeply than if one focuses on similarities. So in the 1990s, there was a move away, I recognise that you need to move away from the inclusive category of being human, and that was expressed as celebrating diversity. So rather than focusing on a characteristic that was the same to everybody, there was the discourse of let's celebrate us in all our diversity. But the challenge with this view is that the points of difference held within minority ethnic groups were still decided, that were celebratory, were decided on by the dominant group.
And I guess this is the model that would apply to, let's say, where you invited African drummers or whatever into school.
Yeah.
Really, because they're rather exotic, and there are real dangers there as well, aren't there?
And having an Indian cultural day and creating an Indian meal in the middle of the day.
Yes.
And whilst there is nothing on its own wrong with that, what it can do in the minds of young people is say, oh, well, all Indians must live like that, all Africans must be drummers, all Africans must do this and that and the other. Yeah.
And it fossilises the culture as well, doesn't it?
It shows the static and fossilising. Yeah. So, in the third slide, you can see that each shape now is appearing on an individual basis, and there is no inclusive category at this point that's being identified. And this is because what I'm proposing is having difference as a starting point for then understanding similarities rather than the other way around. But those differences being something that is the property of everybody. So, for example, there are the two the two triangle shapes there, one of which is a large orange one, the other of which is a small yellow one.
Yes.
If those two relate to each other, then they might come to a better understanding of themselves through focusing on the difference that is evident in the other.
Right.
But that's not being essentialised or stereotyped across a whole group of people. It's about the way in which two individuals relate to each other. And I think one could scale that up to intercultural learning.
Yes, because one of the things that was occurring to me was that this operates on lots of different scales, doesn't it? It operates within a group of people, of a dozen different people, but equally between countries and cultures at the same time.
As long as an understanding of the differences that exist within each of us as an individual is the starting point for that upscaling.
Yes.
If one starts from the broader scale, then immediately one's into generalisations and stereotypes. So I think educationally, it's important to start with one's own differences.
So there's some really important points here about turning things around, looking at difference, but starting from your own difference, and emphasising that rather than taking broad views, and stereotypes are clearly a problem that we want to steer away from.
And some people have criticised my thoughts about this as saying, well, it's important to look at similarities as well, because if you don't look at what connects us as human beings, then, you know, how can we create empathy with others, etc. And my response to that is it's not denying the importance of similarity. The way in which we make sense of the world is to create categories, but it's using difference as the starting point, and from that starting point, once those differences within are understood, then one could start to say, okay, I can also notice there's a category of purple here. There's another category of square shapes. There's yet another category of triangles. And probably there would be many other categories that I'm not even aware of because they're underneath the surface, they're not visible.
So what, in a way, this shifts the centre of gravity, doesn't it?
It does.
It takes a different starting point, and that's why it's so exciting. Oh, thanks for explaining it.
That's okay. And I think what we'll do is we'll use that as the basis for then understanding each of the other sections of this area.
Right. Yes.
Culture, identity,
Yes,
assumptions,
clearly it is the
and
underpinning.
development. Yeah.
Thanks.